So I have to admit, this is not my favorite lesson topic, or at least I find it a very difficult one to approach. Basic chords, like just majors and minors, those are very simple, very logical. Seventh chords are a little more complicated, but even still, not too bad. But when you get into extended chords, like ninth chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords, things start to get kind of weird. So the way I want to deal with this lesson will focus on just the kind of vanilla extended chords, like what is a ninth chord, how do you play it, what's an 11th chord, that sort of stuff. And then the next lesson will look at kind of the weirder stuff, like altered chords or non-tertian harmony, or when, just things start to get very strange. And massive warning up front before we start, I'm going to begin with kind of some of the basics and get things set up, and it's going to feel like review, but this is not a beginner lesson at all. Like if you're not very familiar with seventh chords and you don't know the difference between, say, a G major 7 and a G dominant 7, or you can't play an E minor 7 flat 5 off the top of your head, this is not the lesson to start with right now. Okay, so here's the backbone of this whole chord system. If you want to build a chord, you start on a note, and whatever note you choose will determine what the first part of the chord's name is. So if you start on a G sharp, this is going to be a G sharp something something chord. If you start on a D flat, it'll be a D flat something something chord. And to get the other notes in the chord, you go up in thirds. So if I want to get my next note, go by a third. The next one, go up by another third. And remember that a third can mean a major third or a minor third. A major third is 2 whole steps. Looks like this, or like that, or like that. And then a minor third is a whole step and a half step, which would look like that, or like that, or like that, right? So the way I build this chord is I can choose whether I want to do a major third and a minor third. If I did that, I'd be doing a major chord. I could do a major third and then another major third, doing an augmented chord or whatever other combination I can think of. And then if I want to build a seventh chord, I just stack another one on here. So I go up by another third for a total of 4 notes. And I can use different combinations with this. So I could do a major 7th chord. This would be major third, major third, or I could do a minor 7th chord, or a dominant chord, or a half diminished chord. Whatever combinations I can come up with there. So essentially, all you're doing when you're building these chords is to decide, how many thirds you're going to stack together, and then whether they're going to be, major thirds or minor thirds. That's pretty much the whole tertian harmony system in a nutshell. Tertian harmony meaning harmony built on thirds. Now, just as a teaser, for next week, you can break this. You can do things that don't quite follow this logic and aren't exactly separated by thirds. But the vast majority of chords that you've likely heard are, built on this system. They're very, very common. In fact, even the stuff that doesn't quite follow this logic, it's still kind of analyzed with this framework. So we'll deal with that some next week. But for now, this is kind of how we'll operate. Now, to understand the names of these chords, like why we call this chord a seventh chord, for example, you have to start relating things back to the root note. So if you compare, this note, the distance between it and the root, it's going to be, the interval of a seventh away from that root note, and that's why we call it a seventh chord. In fact, if you take this pattern and you line it up next to, say, a major scale, you can start to see why, everything is called what it is. So I'll go ahead and clean this up and show you that. So here's a major seventh chord lined up next to a major scale. And you can tell why, we call this last note the seventh. You can see why we call this one the fifth, and why we call that one the third, right? Now, if you look at this, we made it up to 4 notes, or a seventh chord, just by stacking thirds. Why not just keep going? So if we have this, we can just stack on another one. And look at that, we have our first extended chord. Now, the term extended chord, it just means a chord that goes beyond the seventh, and that's what we did. So we took another third, ended up somewhere over here. Now, to figure out what to call this, we kind of ran off the edge of our scale there. So, with this scale, we could just repeat it, right? If we started on an F, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This could be number 1 again, and we could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that would look like this. But the problem is that we're trying to relate this note back to the root note. If we call it a 2 or a second, we're talking about this one. Now, taking this, for example, we could call this note a 1. It depends on how we're looking at things, but in the context of this chord and trying to describe what we're doing here, it makes a lot more sense to call it an 8. 8 meaning octave. That makes it clear that we're relating it, back to this first one. And we'd call this one a 9. This one would be a 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. So by saying that this note is a ninth, it's very clear that we're comparing it, all the way to our root note here. So by stacking these thirds, all in a row with a total of 5 notes, we created a ninth chord. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. If we stack another third, we'll have an 11th chord. Stack another third, we have a 13th chord. And that's basically it. That's as far as we can go. If we tried to do another third, we would actually wind up, I didn't draw that terribly well, but we'd wind up back on our root note, right? We've essentially come full circle, and we're just repeating the notes we did down here. If we did another third, we'd be on note number 3, or whatever. And that's why you never hear anyone talk about like a 15th chord or a 17th chord, is because at that point, we're just doing notes over again. Like I said, we're not going to break this system for this lesson. So for now, at least, we're going to operate, with this sort of limit of 7 notes. This is as far as we can take this system. Okay, so that's kind of the high-level picture, but what about the more practical stuff? If I say 7th chord, I could be talking about, a major 7th chord or a minor 7th chord or whatever. If I say 9th chord, same thing. There's lots of different possibilities, for all these little notes that make up a 9th chord. So remember that you're really just trying to figure out 2 things when you're thinking about a chord. You're trying to figure out, how far are you going with these thirds, how many notes are you stacking on top of each other, and 2, what exactly is the combination of major thirds and minor thirds? Where exactly do these notes wind up falling? Is it on a major 7 or a minor 7 or whatever? Now, basic chords are a bit of an exception. With a basic chord, you just have a chord symbol, or a note, and then some little symbol after that. So it could be major or diminished or whatever. Ignore those. Those work a little bit differently. But for everything else, like 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th, all those, you have a note that tells you where the chord starts. You have some kind of symbol or something that tells you, the structure of the chord, and then you have a number, and that number tells you how far out the chord is going. So with a G whatever 7, you're doing a 4-note chord, you're going out to the 7th. If you have a G whatever 11th, you're going out to the 11th. It's that last number that tells you how far out the chord is going. So something like a C minor 7 chord, that is a chord that starts on a C, it goes out to the 7th, you know that from the number, and then it's going to have a minor 3rd, perfect 5th, and a minor 7th. And that's just something from learning about 7th chord. That's what that, minor symbol tells you. If this was, a C major 7, you'd have a C go out to the 7th, and you'd have a major 3rd, perfect 5th, major 7th. Now, for something like a C, try to make that look like a C. For something like a C minor 9, you're going to have a C, you're going all the way out to the 9th, and you're going to have a minor 3rd, perfect 5th, minor 7th, right? That's going to be exactly the same as a C minor 7th. If you have a C major 9, same deal. You have a C major 7th chord with a 9th. That chord symbol part of the chord, that applies to the seventh chord part of it, or the core part of the chord, which is this. It doesn't apply to everything that comes after it, like the 9th, 11th, or 13th. That is handled completely separately. Now, you can have different kinds of ninths. You know, you can have a major third and a minor third. You can have a major second and a minor second. You can have, you know, a major 9, which is what this is. You can have a minor 9, and you can even have an augmented 9, which would be there. Same thing for the 13th. You could have a major 13, minor 13, and augmented 13. The 11 is actually a little different, and if you remember, you know, 11 is kind of just an alias for the 4. And remember, a fourth, you know, it's a perfect interval, so it's either a perfect fourth, or it's a diminished fourth, or it's an augmented fourth. So you would actually call it something, you know, slightly different. But honestly, none of that really matters, because when you're referring to these extensions, you almost always just call them, you know, this, you just call this a ninth, you call this a flat 9, sharp 9, this would be an 11th, flat 11, sharp 11, flat 13, sharp 13. You almost never bother with, you know, major ninth, minor ninth, that kind of thing. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this is considered the default. If I say 9, I'm talking about what is technically a major 9. If I say 11, I'm talking about a perfect 11, or, you know, a major 13. If you wanted to refer to, you know, this note, for example, this would be flat 9, this would be sharp 11, flat 13, you know, and so on. And when you're building these chords, you know, a C major 9 will look like this. A C minor 9 will look like that. Notice the ninth doesn't change at all. And that can be a little bit weird at first, because you see, you know, C minor 9, pretend that squiggle is an M. You see a C minor 9 and you think like minor 9, but the minor part of that, that's one of those chord symbols that is just describing that core part of the chord, that seventh part. The extensions, you know, a 9th or 11th or a 13th, those only change when you have altered chords. That's how you wind up with this kind of thing. And like I said, that's something for next week. So that pretty much covers this whole concept of extended chords, but there's still one more problem, and it's kind of a big one. You know, if I'm playing piano and my right hand is, you know, off playing some melody or something, and I'm going to try to play an F13 chord in my left hand, I mean, that's a 7-note chord. You know, I don't know about you, but I've only got 5 fingers on my left hand. And, you know, I can reach, you know, a 10th, maybe an 11th on a good day, but I definitely cannot reach from, you know, this note all the way out to a 13th. And unless you have astonishingly large hands, neither can you. So, well, and even if you think about a guitar has 6 strings, so you definitely can't do more than 6 notes, but oftentimes, just because of the way the notes are laid out, you can't get more than like 4 that you actually need. So, you know, something has to give with these monstrously huge chords. Now, believe it or not, some notes in these chords are actually more important than others. So if I take just a C major 7, for example, if you listen to that chord, then listen to a C minor 7, of course they sound very different. If I leave out the 5th, not a whole lot changes. You know, it's still very clear which one is which. They sound very distinct, and you're actually not missing a whole lot by leaving out that 5th. And that's because the 5th is the same for, you know, major chords or minor chords. It rarely changes. So it's not really adding anything terribly unique to the harmony. You know, if I try to leave out, say, the 7th, I get something, you know, vastly different. These chords sound, you know, completely changed. If I leave out the 3rd, same thing. In fact, with this, you can't really tell if I'm going for a dominant 7 or a minor 7 or what. So the third and the seventh, they need to be there. The root needs to be there because it's the root of the chord, but the fifth, it's really not that important unless you're doing a chord that has like a lowered fifth. You know, if I'm doing a half diminished chord, that fifth is contributing a lot to the unique sound of that chord, and I would definitely want it there. But when I'm putting together these chords, I can definitely leave out the fifth as long as it's just a normal perfect fifth. And also, if you're playing with a bass player, you don't necessarily need to worry about the root note. That's the bass player's job. So if someone else is doing, you know, this note, then you could just do this, and you have a nice C minor 7 chord. You don't really need the fifth. Someone else is dealing with the root note. Now when it comes to something like an 11th chord, say I'm playing a C minor 11th this time, you know, I'm essentially playing a harmony that, you know, starts here and goes all the way out to, you know, the 11th. So I can leave off the fifth. I don't necessarily need that one. I definitely need the third. I definitely need a seventh. I need the root if I don't have a bass player. Like I said, you know, you can get away with not doing a root note if someone else is doing it, obviously. And, you know, ideally, I want the 11th. I mean, that's part of the harmony that we're going for here. So if I don't play an 11th, I'm not really playing a C minor 11th chord. So I can leave off the fifth. I don't necessarily need the ninth. I mean, it's nice to have, and, you know, saying 11th, it does imply that there's a ninth. But if I leave off the ninth, you know, I still have that 11th harmony sound, so I'm not really losing anything too enormous. So I could get away with that. So we'll say this one's, you know, kind of optional. I definitely want this one. But if I'm, you know, say playing on a guitar, like I said, you can get into some really tough situations on guitar. If I absolutely have to, I can leave off the 11th. You know, I need to have the third, the seventh, and the root. But if there is just simply no practical way of hitting all these notes, I would leave off the 11 before I leave off one of those, because you don't want to screw up the core harmony of the chord. That's kind of fundamental to it. So if you had an 11th but you dropped the 7th, say, you've really got something, it's going to sound incomplete, and you really don't want that. And then the kind of last thing here is that you can invert these chords. You can shuffle notes around the same way that you do with basic chords or with 7th chords. So like with this ninth, you know, I have a very hard time playing this with one hand. I can do it, but it's not easy. I mean, for anyone with smaller hands, it's just not something you can do. So what I can do is take the C and, you know, move it up, do something like that, and I have a very nice inverted chord. Now, obviously, I can't play this with one hand, so I would probably end up just putting the C right here. Wind up with that. And when it comes to inverting and shuffling notes around, you really have to use a lot of musical judgment here and decide what sounds good and what doesn't. In this case, you know, this works pretty well. But if I try to do this down lower, things can start to get kind of muddled, and, you know, this may not sound quite so good. So you have to use a lot of judgment there. And you do need to be careful when you're inverting very large chords, because it's very easy to lose a sense of what the root note is. I mean, if you have a chord like this, you know, C minor 11th again, if I start playing around with this and inverting it, it's pretty easy to wind up with something that, you know, this could sound like an E flat chord, or I could wind up sounding like a G chord. I mean, there's all these kind of simpler chords that you can kind of see showing up inside of this bigger chord. So you do need to be careful with that. And I will probably talk more about that, you know, next week with some of the other more advanced examples, a little more about inversion. So that's the kind of general idea here, is that you're going to leave off notes if you have to. And sometimes you can actually split the chord up. You'll just, you know, say if I'm trying to play this, let's see, like the C minor 9 again, I could actually, you know, put the note down here and then play the rest of the chord. That actually sounds really nice. So that's one way of dealing with chords that you simply cannot play with one hand. But basically use your musical judgment and play them best you can. So I think that's more than enough material for one lesson. If you have questions, leave them. And if there's anything you want to, you know, make sure that I cover in the next lesson on this, let me know. I'll be working on that next week. I have a Patreon page if you want to contribute, help me make more. And otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.